Welcome to the deep dive. You bring us the source material, the articles, the research, things you want to understand better, and we dive in together.
Our job is to cut through that noise, find the key insights, and really give you that shortcut to knowing what's going on.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at something you shared that's it's pretty deep in the tech weeds, but has these significant geopolitical ripples. It's a piece of open source software called easyjson.
Yeah, we've got articles, security analyses, all raising some, frankly, serious questions about it. Not necessarily about the code itself today, but where it comes from.
And what that might mean down the road. So our mission today, understand what easyjson is, get clear on these concerns, see how people are reacting, and figure out what this tells us about, the bigger picture of software trust.
Sounds good. It's a fascinating case study, really.
Okay, let's unpack this. First up, easyjson. What actually is it?
Okay, so simply put, easyjson is an open source tool. It's a piece of software. Its main function is something called serialization, specifically for the Go programming language, mostly. It helps turn Go data structures into JSON format and back again.
Serialization. So like packaging up data so it can be sent or stored easily, like making complex stuff into simple text.
That's a good way to put it, exactly. And the sources we looked at really stress how widely used this thing is.
It's not some obscure little tool then.
Not at all. They mention it's used by the U.S. Department of Defense.
Wow, okay.
And they use the word extensively when talking about its presence in finance, technology, healthcare software, big sectors. Plus, it's used inside other open source projects, so it kind of spiders out across the whole cloud ecosystem.
So it's buried like deep in the foundations of a lot of systems we rely on, maybe without even knowing it.
Pretty much, yeah.
How long has it been around? What's its history?
It appeared on GitHub back in 2016. Interestingly, the sources note that most of the big updates, the main development, happened before 2020.
Okay, so it's relatively mature code.
Seems that way. And here's a key detail. The GitHub account it's hosted under is linked to Mail.ru.
Mail.ru, the Russian internet company.
That's the one. And Mail.ru is owned by a bigger Russian tech conglomerate called VK.
VK, okay. And that connection, the VK link, that's really where the current security concerns start, isn't it?
That's the thread, yeah. That's what the security company Hunted Labs started pulling on.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Tell us about this VK group link.
Right, so VK group, it's often described as like Russia's version of Facebook, a huge social media and internet company there.
Got it.
The really significant point, according to the sources, is who's running it. Since December 2021, the CEO is a man named Vladimir Kiriyenko.
Kiriyenko. Why is that name important here?
Well, he's the son of one of Vladimir Putin's top aides.
Yeah.
And maybe more directly relevant, Kiriyenko himself was sanctioned.
Sanctioned by the U.S.
By the U.S., yes, and others back in February 2022, right around the time Russia invaded Ukraine.
Okay, that's a direct link to sanctions. But the sources are clear. The company VK Group itself isn't sanctioned.
That's a crucial distinction they make, yes. The company is not sanctioned, but its CEO is, because of those government ties.
And Hunted Labs connects this back to easyjson how?
Their analysis points out that the developers who've been most active on the easyjson project, particularly in recent years, list their location publicly as Moscow.
Right, so let me see if I got this straight. You have this widely used software.
Foundational, even.
Foundational software used in critical areas like defense and finance, maintained mostly by developers apparently in Moscow, working under the umbrella of a company whose CEO is personally sanctioned due to Kremlin connections. That's the picture.
That's the picture Hunted Labs is painting, yes. And it's really important to repeat what Hunted Labs themselves stress. They are not saying they've found like a secret backdoor or a vulnerability in easyjson right now.
Okay, so the code, as it sits today, isn't the known problem.
Correct. The alarm isn't about a discovered exploit. It's about the potential risk. The what if.
The what if, based on who controls it and maintains it, especially given the current global situation.
Exactly that. In today's geopolitical climate, that chain Moscow developers sanctioned CEO's company, that's the red flag for Hunted Labs.
They quote one of the founders, Hayden Smith.
Yeah, Hayden Smith. He calls easyjson a really critical package, even a linchpin for the cloud-native ecosystem.
Well, linchpin, strong word.
It is. And he describes it as being maintained by a group of individuals based in Moscow, belonging to an organization that has this suspicious history. Suspicious because of the CEO's ties and sanctions.
And the potential risk they're worried about isn't just theoretical, right?
Yeah.
They mention specific ways it could be misused.
They do. The fear they spell out is that Russia could potentially leverage this control over easyjson in the future, maybe change the code subtly later on.
What were they suggesting?
They talk about it being a potential sleeper cell within critical software.
A software sleeper cell. That sounds dramatic. What kind of harm are we talking about?
Well, the scenarios Hunted Labs raises include modifying it down the line to steal sensitive data, cause major disruptions to U.S. infrastructure, or use it for, espionage or influence campaigns.
Wow. So it's about the potential for future weaponization, essentially stemming from who holds the keys.
That's the core of their argument, yes.
The sources also mentioned George Barnes, an advisor to Hunted Labs. What's his take?
Yeah, Barnes offers a slightly different angle. He actually starts by acknowledging the code's quality. He's quoted saying it's totally efficient code. There's no known vulnerability about it.
So he agrees the code itself isn't flawed right now.
Right. He's upfront about that. Hence, no other company has identified anything wrong with it. But then he pivots immediately to the concern.
Which is?
He says, yet the people who actually own it are under the guise of VK, which is tight with the Kremlin.
So same concern, different phrasing.
Pretty much, and he puts himself in the shoes of, say, Russian intelligence, the GRU, or FSB.
What does he think they'd see?
He uses this analogy, like, if I'm sitting there in the GRU or the FSB and I'm looking at the laundry list of opportunities, this is perfect, it's just lying there.
Meaning it's a potential asset just waiting to be exploited because of who controls it, even if it's perfectly fine code today?
That's the implication. What's fascinating here is how seemingly innocuous software, just doing its job efficiently, can become a strategic target simply because of its provenance and maintenance structure.
Yeah, control becomes the vulnerability, not the code itself necessarily. It's a different way of thinking about risk.
Absolutely. It's that potential for future manipulation.
So, faced with these warnings from Hunted Labs, how did the different organizations involved react? What did the sources say?
Well, according to the reporting, VK Group didn't respond when asked for comment about easyjson.
Okay, silence from them. What about the U.S. Department of Defense, since they were mentioned as a user?
Also, no comment reported when they were asked about using software that includes easyjson.
And U.S. cybersecurity agencies, CISA, NSA.
The NSA spokesperson quoted basically said they don't comment on specific software like this. But they did add, their collaboration center welcomes tips, and they do share info if threats are confirmed.
A standard response, maybe.
Seems like it. And CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, apparently just points people back to Hunted Labs' findings.
So not dismissing it, but not taking direct action based on this report either.
That appears to be the case based on the sources.
What about GitHub, where the code actually lives? They're owned by Microsoft now.
GitHub's response was interesting. They said they investigate if policies are broken, but right now they aren't aware of any malicious code in easyjson, and they made a specific point. VK, the company, isn't actually sanctioned by GitHub.
That's a key distinction again. Government sanctions versus a platform's own rules or enforcement actions.
Exactly. And it highlights how different companies might react. The sources remind us that Apple did take action related to VK back in 2022.
Oh, yeah, what was that?
They removed VK's social media app from the App Store after the UK sanctioned some Russian bank leaders who had stakes in VK.
So responses can vary. It's not a monolithic approach across the tech industry.
Definitely not.
Did the sources talk to other software security experts about this easyjson situation? Get outside opinions.
Yes. They quote Dan Larenk, who's the CEO of ChainGuard, another company focused on software supply chain security.
And what did he think?
Larenk's take was nuanced. He noted that, look, with easyjson, these connections to Russia, they aren't hidden. They're in plain sight, as he put it.
So transparency isn't the issue here.
Not in this specific case, no. He agrees there's probably a slightly higher cybersecurity risk because of these connections compared to, say, some random library. But he also immediately points out a broader problem.
Which is?
That figuring out who developers really are, where they're based, their affiliations, that's often super difficult in the open source world generally. Identities can be obscured.
Right. So easyjson might be unusually clear in its connections?
Perhaps. And Larenk had this really interesting quote. He said something like, the code is what we have to trust, and the code and the systems that are used to build that code.
Okay.
But then he added, people are important, but we're just not in a world where we can push the trust down to the developers.
Wow. That really nails a central tension, doesn't it? You want to trust the code, But the code is made and maintained by people within systems in specific places under specific influences.
Exactly. You can't entirely separate the code from its human and geopolitical context, even if you wish you could just focus on the technical bits.
And this whole conversation isn't happening in isolation, is it?
Yeah.
The sources seem to frame this easyjson issue within a much bigger shift happening around open source trust.
Absolutely. Especially since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been way more scrutiny on these things.
Hmm.
Geopolitics is intersecting with open source development in ways it maybe didn't as overtly before.
Are there other examples of this?
Yeah, the sources mention a Linux kernel maintainer, for instance, who removed about 11 Russian developers last year, explicitly citing sanctions concerns.
Really, just based on nationality and sanctions.
Apparently so, in that case. And the Linux Foundation itself has put out guidance, basically advising developers to be cautious about interactions because of the complex sanctions landscape.
So the old open source ideal of pure borderless collaboration is, well, it's running up against some harsh geopolitical realities.
It seems to be, yes. And all this is happening while we're also becoming much more aware of actual supply chain attacks.
Like that easyutils situation recently.
Exactly. That was a huge wake-up call.
Remind us briefly what happened there.
Sure, it involved a very widely used data compression tool called easyutils. An attacker, using the fake name Gia10, spent maybe 2 years patiently building trust within that open source project.
2 years, wow.
Yeah, contributing code, becoming a maintainer, and then very stealthily inserted a sophisticated backdoor into the software.
A backdoor that could have potentially compromised countless systems worldwide.
Huge potential impact. And the scary part, it was discovered almost by accident, not through any standard security audit.
Right, a developer noticed some performance issues. Pure chance.
Exactly. So that XZ case makes the kind of sleeper cell scenario that Hunted Labs is warning about with easyjson feel, well, less theoretical, more like a demonstrated attack pattern.
Yeah, it proves that patient, state-level actors can infiltrate and compromise critical open source projects.
And the sources bring in some academics from Carnegie Mellon's Software Engineering Institute on this changing landscape. Nancy Mead talks about how open source used to be like smaller groups. People kind of knew each other, development was slower, reviews were maybe more thorough.
A trusted circle.
Yeah, and she says back then, no one expected a trusted developer of being a hacker. That just wasn't the assumption.
But that assumption is shattered now.
Pretty much. And her colleague, Scott Hissam, adds that while companies aren't yet doing deep background checks on every open source contributor as standard practice.
That sounds impractical anyway.
It probably is, but he thinks that trend is coming. More focus on details beyond just, does the code work? Things like, who maintains it? Where are they? What organization, if any, are they tied to? He says activities are underway to collect more of that kind of insight for people using open source.
So a shift towards needing more. Let's call it provenance information for software.
That seems to be the direction. Yeah, more data points to make better risk assessments.
Okay, so pulling this all together, this specific case with easyjson, the broader context of geopolitical tension, easyutils, what does this really mean for how organizations should approach the software that, let's face it, runs almost everything now?
Well, Hunted Labs, the ones raising the alarm on easyjson, they're careful to say they are not telling people to just ditch open source.
Right, that would grind the world to a halt.
Completely impractical. Instead, what Hayden Smith from Hunted Labs is quoted as saying is that the goal is to encourage risk-informed decisions.
Risk-informed decisions, meaning?
Meaning you need to be aware of these potential risks like provenance, maintainer affiliations, geopolitical context, and factor them into your choices about which software to use, especially for critical applications. The risk landscape is shifting.
It's not just about whether the code functions correctly anymore.
Not entirely, no. Smith has this quote that really sticks. He says, open source software is basically good until it's not.
Oof, yeah, that's sobering. It forces you to consider that tipping point when good might become not good.
It really does. And if you connect the dots, this easyjson case is just a really sharp example of this massive challenge we face. How do you balance the undeniable value, the speed, the innovation of open source?
Which has enabled so much, like the entire cloud.
Exactly. How do you balance that with this growing need for, frankly, more diligence, more understanding about where this stuff comes from, who's behind it, how it's built, especially when geopolitics gets involved?
Hey, let's bring this right back to you, the listener. Why does this deep dive into one specific, maybe obscure-sounding tool like easyjson actually matter to your life?
Because, as those sources highlighted, this tool isn't just anywhere. It's likely embedded deep inside software you rely on,
Like what?
like your online banking systems, maybe your healthcare provider's portal, potentially government services you interact with, apps on your phone, critical infrastructure.
So even though you've never heard of easyjson, its security, its trustworthiness could potentially affect you quite directly.
Absolutely. This single case, even without a smoking gun today, shows how these complex global supply chains and geopolitical risks can create potential vulnerabilities way down in the foundations of technology we all depend on. It highlights how hard it is to even know all the hidden pieces your software relies on.
It's a really powerful illustration, actually. Global politics,
Yeah.
seemingly obscure code, fundamentally linked, with potential real-world impacts. Okay, so let's try to sum this up. easyjson, efficient code, works well, used everywhere.
Hmm.
No known exploits or backdoors right now.
All right.
BHE. Its maintenance largely by developers in Moscow, under the umbrella of VK Group, whose CEO is sanctioned due to Kremlin ties.
Yeah.
That whole picture is raising serious red flags for security researchers like Hunted Labs.
Especially in light of things like the XE attack and the current geopolitical climate. The potential for misuse is the concern.
Which really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it?
It definitely raises an important one.
And that question, the one for you to think about, is this.
Yeah.
We live in a world built on these incredibly complex webs of open source software, developers scattered globally, contributing to foundational code. How can we as individuals, as companies, as societies, how can we truly assess and manage the trust we place in these building blocks, the ones powering everything from our social media to the power grid? What level of scrutiny is practical? What level is enough?
Yeah. Something definitely worth pondering as you go about your day using all this technology.